Good afternoon or evening, wherever you might be. Welcome to week 34 of our continuing voyage through the entire Bible in 1 year, August 20th through August 26th. Our reading is effectively Jeremiah 21, verse 1 through 31, verse 40, and Ezekiel 23, verse 1 through 28, verse 26. And our reading for the week begins with the story, a rather graphic story, of two promiscuous sisters, Oholah and Oholibah. The story clearly appears to be a type showing in graphic detail the way God viewed the behavior of Israel and Judah. It's not describing their actual behaviors. It is comparing them to the behavior of effectively prostitutes. We tend to think that maybe it is no big deal to worship on a tall hill, which was one of the things they were doing. I mean, it's nature, it's out there, it's God's creation, but clearly God makes it very clear in this story that violating his commands, his direct instructions as do this, do that, is analogous to adultery. And remember, the two prophets we're reading in this section are Jeremiah, who is still in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel, who is in Babylon or near Babylon. So I'd like to begin by reading, he says glibly, Ezekiel 23, verse 40. The Lord said to me, this is again Ezekiel, the Lord said to me, Son of man, will you judge Oholah and Oholibah? Then confront them with their detestable practices, for they have committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. They committed adultery with their idols. They even sacrificed their children. This is the horrible sacrifice of children to Molech, the unbelievable, whom they bore to me as food for them, as food for these evil idols. Clearly, this is a cut above just worshiping on a hill. They have also done this to me. At that same time, they defiled my sanctuary and desecrated my Sabbaths. On the very day they sacrificed their children to their idols, they entered my sanctuary and desecrated it. That is what they did in my house. And I would like to read our editor's comment on this. This is in my copy. It's on page 1069, right after Ezekiel 23, verse 49. What more can be said? God feels deeply the shame and disgrace that his bride has brought him. Her disrespect for his spiritual leadership, her chasing after material satisfaction, and her many adulteries with lesser gods have left him no choice. Israel must be put away until she repents. The time has come, even now it begins. So, again, good old Ezekiel is over in Babylon, and it's approximately, or Mr. Smith at least concluded, and I think this agrees with other commentators I've read, that at about 590 BC, King Zedekiah in Jerusalem decides to effectively unilaterally revoke the agreement with Babylon that made Judah a vassal state to Nebuchadnezzar. He basically thinks he's going to go his own way. And that results in aggravation of Nebuchadnezzar. And in the year 588 BC, according to our editor, and I think he's correct, Ezekiel is informed that the siege of Babylon has begun. I'd like to read a brief passage from Ezekiel 24, verses 1 and 2. This is the day, and it defines exactly what day this is. Ezekiel 24, verses 1 and 2, which our editor ties to the date 588 BC. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. So in fact, without the magic of an internet, on the day of the beginning of the siege, Ezekiel informs all of the residents around him, at least, in Babylon, that Jerusalem is under siege. The next little section is a terribly troubling passage in which the Lord tells Ezekiel that his wife is to die and he is not to mourn her. And he basically says this is an analog of the fall of Jerusalem, that the surrounding nations will be overjoyed at the fall of Jerusalem when it happens. The fall has not occurred yet. But this is, in fact, the beginning of the end for Jerusalem and Judah. Now, note, this is the beginning of the 70-year captivity that has already been prophesied. We read that at least 2 weeks back, the prophecy about the 70-year captivity. In addition, I would bring your attention clear back to Leviticus, Leviticus 26, verse 34, and also verse 43. I am reading from our 1 year of Bible reading. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years all the time that it lies desolate, and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths all the time that it lies desolate. The land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths you lived in it. So already in Leviticus, this is in the time of Moses, it's stated that the Jews are going to fail to follow the Sabbath rules, letting their land rest every 7th year. They're not going to do that, and the land is going to get its Sabbaths during the 70-year captivity. It doesn't say 70 there, but that is what we know is coming. And the other passage reads as follows: For the land will be deserted by them and will enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. They will pay for their sins because they rejected my laws and abhorred my decrees. Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am the Lord, their God. But for their sake, I will remember the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of Egypt, in the sight of the nations, to be their God. I am the Lord. So as early as Leviticus, the events we're now reading about were effectively prophesied. So Jeremiah back in Jerusalem, and I would note to you that at this point that many scholars say that at the time Ezekiel's wife died, that he did not speak again until the fall of Jerusalem. Our editor seems to say that he continued to prophesy. I am not sufficiently a Bible scholar to resolve that inconsistency, but the fact is, some say that he was mute until the fall of Jerusalem. But in Jerusalem, Jeremiah is preaching, and I'm going to read Jeremiah chapter 21, verses 8 through 13. Furthermore, tell the people, this is what the Lord says. See, I am setting before you the way of life and the way of death. Whoever stays in this city will die by the sword, famine, or plague. But whoever goes out and surrenders to the Babylonians who are besieging you will live. He will escape with his life. I have determined to do this city harm and not good, declares the Lord. It will be given into the hands of the king of Babylon, and he will destroy it with fire. Moreover, say to the royal house of Judah, hear the word of the Lord, O house of David. This is what the Lord says. Administer justice every morning. Rescue from the hand of his oppressor the one who has been robbed, or my wrath will break out and burn like fire. Because of the evil you have done, burn with no one to quench it. I am against you, Jerusalem, you who live in this valley on the rocky plateau, declares the Lord. So on sight, Jeremiah is warning people, the end is about to be upon us. So Jeremiah, because of this rather negative preaching, not well received by Zedekiah, because of that, he is in fact placed under arrest. And then I would like to read a summary that is from Jeremiah telling us basically the history that led to the fall. This is his, this is his summary of the history of Jerusalem. You performed miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt and have continued them to this day. This is Jeremiah in Jerusalem, speaking of the Lord. Both in Israel and among all mankind, and have gained the renown that is still yours. You brought your people Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with great terror. You gave them this land you had sworn to give their forefathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. They came in and took possession of it, but they did not obey you or follow your law. They did not do what you commanded them to do, so you have brought all this disaster upon them. So we see that indeed this is the beginning of the end, as Jeremiah has been prophesying. And I'd just like to read a few of the prophecies Jeremiah makes at this time concerning the fact that there will be a new day, that indeed God will forgive them and return them. Jeremiah 30, verses 4 through 8. These are the words the Lord spoke concerning Israel and Judah. This is what the Lord says. Cries of fear are heard, terror, not peace. Ask and see. Can a man bear children? Then why do I see every strong man with his hands on his stomach, like a woman in labor, every face turned deathly pale? How awful that day will be. None will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob, but he will be saved out of it. In that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will break the yoke off their necks, and I will tear off their bonds. No longer will foreigners enslave them. Instead, they will serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. So do not fear, O Jacob, my servant. Do not be dismayed, O Israel. Here we see clearly that there's the promise of release from bondage, and note, it appears to be looking forward clear to Jesus when it says they will serve the Lord their God and David their king, David's ancestor being Jesus. At Jeremiah 31, verses 16 and 17, he says glibly, trying to find them, restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work will be rewarded, declares the Lord. They will return from the land of the enemy. So there is hope for your future, declares the Lord. So again, Jeremiah, although he is preaching disaster to some degree, he is nonetheless foretelling a recovery. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. When I bring them back from captivity, the people in the land of Judah and in its towns will once again use these words. The Lord bless you, O righteous dwelling, sacred mountain. People will live together in Judah and all its towns, farmers and those who move about with their flocks. I will refresh the weary and satisfy the faint. So Jeremiah then clearly seems to look much farther forward, because he now, well, I'm going to actually read a passage of our editor first, and then I'm going to read a passage that to me is clearly looking beyond the return to Jerusalem. Here's our editor's words. Here now are three separate discourses in which Jeremiah appears to reach beyond the end of the 70-year exile to a kingdom of a different nature and to the Messiah who will save his people from their sins. In two of the discourses, Jeremiah repeats virtually the same poetic prophecy, which itself is similar to several prophecies brought by Isaiah. So Jeremiah 23, verses 7 and 8. So then the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the descendants of Israel up out of the land of the north, and out of all the countries where he had banished them, then they will live in their own land. Clearly, this one is looking forward to the coming recovery 70 years hence. And then when we jump clear over to Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, and incidentally, our editor at this point has given a little title that says, A New Covenant. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. This clearly seems to look forward to Jesus. So the remaining prophecies that Ezekiel makes in the reading that we've had this week, during the siege or perhaps before, again, we don't know if he was mute during the period of the siege or not. Ezekiel is back in Babylon. But what he is doing with these remaining prophecies, he condemns the nations surrounding Jerusalem who were glorified, if you will, or they were extremely happy by the fall of Jerusalem. And it's really interesting. He tells us that Tyre, specifically, the city of Tyre, is to be destroyed. And what's interesting is history reveals this, and I believe our editor has also commented on this. The city of Tyre there was an attempt made to besiege the city by Nebuchadnezzar, but it was not completely successful because part of the city was on an island. And they figured they were pretty darn smart, that they had it all figured out by living on this island, that they were not going to be conquered. But in point of fact, later, the Greeks built a causeway out to the island and successfully demolished the city of Tyre. So it did become a place for the drying of nets. And I'd like to read one little section of Ezekiel's comments about why Tyre is going to be so totally destroyed. And I'm hopeful that we will all recognize that this is talking about arrogance. This was an arrogant nation, and there are some arrogant nations in our midst today. So we need to be cautious to fall into this trap. This is Ezekiel speaking specifically about Tyre. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out of you, and it consumed you. So indeed, that will happen, but it's not Nebuchadnezzar who will be the ultimate arbiter of the finish of Tyre. So with that, we conclude our readings for the week, and we look forward to meeting again.